Good morning. This is Debbie Gilmer from the Workforce Development System at Centero. It's my pleasure to welcome you this morning. Just another friendly reminder to please put your phones on mute. Here in Augusta with me is Lisa Sturdivant from DHHS, Letitia Hutman from DHHS, and our techno gurus, Julia and Bridget. David Hoff was supposed to be here, as many of you know. The workshop that was scheduled for yesterday was canceled due to the weather, and so David is coming to us today from Boston, and it's my pleasure to welcome David. I'm not sure he needs much of an introduction. There's his adorable face looking at us from his favorite pastime, sailing in Boston, and so without further ado, I'll be back at the end with some updates. In the meantime, don't forget to type your questions into the chat room. I'll be monitoring those, and we'll be taking questions as we go. So turning it over to you, David. Welcome.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you so much for having me on this webinar. And obviously, we will be rescheduling the full-day training on fading and natural supports. But obviously, the weather, as we all know, in New England is a bit iffy at times. So you have to better safe than sorry. So as Debbie said, I work for the Institute for Community Inclusion at UMass Boston, do training and technical assistance on a variety of employment issues. I've actually been a job coach, job developer in the past, so I've actually practiced some of what I'm going to preach about today. As Debbie said, one of my favorite pastimes is me on the Charles River in Boston. Obviously, I'm not doing much sailing right now, but I'm already counting the days till April 1st when I can get back out on the water. So, but thanks for taking the time today to attend. So my contact information, you have copies of today's slides, so I'm not going to go through this in detail, but if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact me by phone or by email, phone 617-287-4308, email david.hoff@umb.edu. ICI has a really great website, communityinclusion.org, which has a whole variety of materials that can be downloaded at no charge. And if you're a Twitter fan, you can follow me on @DavidHoff10 is my Twitter handle, where I don't do a ton of stuff on Twitter, but I occasionally send out disability advocacy information, things like that. I promise you I do not focus on my latest movie reviews or favorite restaurants. It's a disability advocacy Twitter account. So if you're into Twitter, I would welcome you to follow me. I'd be happy to follow you as well. So that's kind of the logistics. The way I'm going to do this webinar also is kind of a series of myths and facts about natural supports and fading. In terms of this issue, it's interesting, as I've worked on it, I've seen kind of, things that I thought, well, everybody knows that. And yet, as I work with folks around the country and here in Massachusetts, it's interesting that still some of the old thinking in terms of supported employment and job coaching is still pretty apparent, not only among individual programs and staff, but among systems as well. So I think it's really critically important that we really understand what we're talking about here in terms of the realities of both natural supports and fading. So that's my goal over the next hour, is to touch on topics. Obviously, this is a webinar. We can't go into a lot of heavy-duty detail on these issues, but hopefully provide you some food for thought. So the first myth that I want to mention is that the primary role of employment support staff is to train the individual on the job. Often job coaches, employment support staff still think of themselves primarily as trainers. And yet the reality is that while training may, and we'll get into more detail on this later, but training may be a part of a professional's role on a job site, that should be done only as absolutely necessary and only after consideration of other less intrusive considerations. And some of this goes back to really the origination of the concept of a job coach in the mid-1980s, where there was this, frankly, presumption that people with significant disabilities would only be able to succeed on a job with a job coach if the job coach, and employers would only be willing to hire them if the job coach really acted as the de facto trainer and support person, and just we were so happy that the employer was willing to hire this person that we would take care of everything else, supervising and training them, making sure that, and fading over time. And yet, I think there's been a long-term recognition that's evolved since the mid-'80s A couple of things have happened. Number one, we've recognized that not only that employers actually can handle a lot more of the support than we give them credit for. And the second thing is they're actually better than us at a lot of this. It doesn't mean that there's still not a need for a job coach. It doesn't mean that there's still not a need for employment support professionals. But I think those roles have really changed and evolved over time, and I think we need to recognize that. And part of this evolution also is just the changing role of the professionals in our field in general. And I still think we struggle with this. I think I've struggled with this in my own role when I've done direct service, that we are working on really going from a role of caretaker, of being a trainer, frankly being an authoritative figure for these people. I was always struck when I was doing more direct service how often individuals with disabilities say, well, I have to check with my staff, or my staff told me I have to do this, or even when I was observing some of my coworkers on job sites and the way they were kind of acting as a supervisor for individuals and providing them direction, it really was not a good setup in terms of a integration, but also just the power dynamics between an individual with a disability and staff. So I think and it's not to say that people are not well intended in these roles, but I think that what we've recognized is we've really got to think all collectively about our roles in very different ways. And I still think we're in the midst of trying to do this. Some of you may have seen, if you see me present, I sometimes do a thing about the evolution of the medical model to the social model. The medical model of disability is basically 400 years old, and which is really that caretaker, people who are going to be in permanent poverty and need lots of help, to a social model which is 30 years old. And so it's a 400-year-old model takes a long time to evolve and change and fade out, but when we're really in the midst of that. But I think what we're evolving to is something really exciting and really making change not only in the lives of people with disabilities, but in the world in general. So our roles now are facilitator of inclusion, really making sure the folks are being facilitated within their communities, facilitating community supports. Our role is not to provide the supports, but what's out there that can support this individual, can support them in succeeding on a job and in a community. That's our job. That we're really here to be a social change agent and to be a support professional, not an authoritative figure, but think of yourselves as, I have professionals in my life. I have bankers. I have lawyers I deal with occasionally. I have, financial people who help what little money I have to invest it and things like that. Those are support professionals who I expect customer service from. And I think we have to think of ourselves in that same kind of view of, I'm a professional supporting this person. They are my customer. That's a very different role than what we've customarily had. So as we think about these roles, these are some things to think about. And also, we need to think about the fact that this is not just about changing our lives, changing individual lives. So yes, we're there to change the lives of people with disabilities, help them have jobs, help them have income, hopefully have a path at least on the way to the middle class, make connections with folks, be part of their communities, all of that kind of stuff. But we're about changing the community itself, its receptivity to folks with significant disabilities. We really are change agents. And not only about changing our local communities up there in Maine, but also the world at large. If we can make the world, frankly, in my view, a little more open-minded, a little more tolerant, a little more welcoming of people who are diverse, people who have not readily always been accepted, that's going to really make a difference in day-to-day lives of all of us. And so it's not just about the individual, it's about the community, it's about the world at large. And I recognize when you're out there job coaching, on a Sunday morning, and, I've been there, done that, you may not think that you're changing the world, but you really are. You're really making the world kind of a more open, welcoming place. And I think that's really sometimes we have to recognize that you really are an agent of social change. The second myth is that you just sit back and wait for natural supports to naturally happen. That natural supports will just happen and I think this has been one of the, frankly, fallacies of natural supports, that there's this kind of think, if we do natural supports, you just sit back and see what happens. The reality is natural supports do not happen naturally. And they are supports that are either what are typically available, and we'll talk about some examples in a second, or that are perceived as what we call normative. So a good example of that is a coworker who might be providing extra assistance to a person with disability that they may not be normally providing to other coworkers, but that's still normative. Getting assistance from a coworker is a very normal thing in any workplace. And the support is either provided spontaneously by workplace resources, so it might happen automatically, because it's something that automatically happens in a workplace, or the job coach, the employment support professional, part of their job is to look around and say, how do we be a catalyst here for natural supports? How can I, provide some assistance here to the coworkers, or look at the workplace in general and say, what's available here that I can bring into play here that would be more natural than me acting as essentially a trainer or intervening in a more intrusive fashion. And what we need to recognize, and God knows I get lots of support in my workplace, and I think we all do, that support is a natural part of any workplace, that we have coworkers, that we have systems, that we have structure that is a support of the workplace. I often joke about myself, and anybody knows me, I am not the most focused person in the world in many ways. I'm 20 directions at once. Definitely, there's definitely some indications of, of things like, a deficit, tilted deficit disorder and things like that in terms of me trying to stay focused. It's often difficult for me. I need a lot of structure, so I know how to work within that. That is really important to me. I don't do well unstructured. And each workplace also has its own culture. That's the other thing we need to recognize really clearly, that in some places, frankly, it's okay to have 12 piercings and tattoos and maybe sometimes swear like a sailor. That's okay in some workplaces. Now, not in the workplace I work in. You could have tattoos here. I don't know and maybe even some piercings. But swearing is not particularly tolerated really highly in my workplace. But if, frankly, you work in construction or a loading dock, that's just part of that culture. Versus a fairly white-collar office environment where, frankly, there might be a need for more conformity in terms of dress, in terms of how you look and things like that, although certainly there's been more openness there. So I think part of the support professional's job is to look at that work culture and say, what's tolerated here? What's available? How does a person fit in? We need to recognize, and we'll go into more details on this in a second, when we bring in external supports, when we bring in a job coach, that can have a lot of effects on the workplace, and not all of those effects can be necessarily positive. We'll talk about that more in a second. And that also we need to recognize that if we're going to have good natural supports, if we're going to have supports, we really need to partner with business. We really need to talk to them about, how this is going to work, and really work with them and understand how their business operates, what's available there, how do we take advantage of it, how do we leverage that support. And here are some examples, and these are just a few, and I'm sure folks, if you want to throw a few others in the chat box, feel free to do so. But these are just a few that are typically available. Supervisor instruction. We all get instructions from supervisors. We all have a boss somewhere. Some of us are more compliant than others, but we at least have somebody telling us what to do and how to do it. Standard orientation and training. That is a natural support example. I think it's interesting. I've seen in workplaces with folks with disabilities where there's been like, well, they don't need to go through the typical orientation and training because they won't understand it. I'm like, they absolutely need to go through that. That is part of the work culture. That is part of the support. If they need extra assistance understanding what's going on there, that's fine. But that is a social norm in the workplace that they should be dealing with, and maybe the job coach afterwards helps explain things or go through things, or maybe whoever's doing the orientation, we do the orientation maybe a little differently, but it should be, but if everybody else goes through it, the person with a disability should go through it, no matter what their level of disability. Ongoing staff development and training, both formal and informal, we all have that. That's certainly part of what happens. Assistance from coworkers, we already touched on that. Again, we all get assistance every day. A work schedule is a natural support. We have a work schedule. We have day-to-day tasks that we do. We also have a schedule that we have to report and do. So carpooling, a good example. I think transportation can also be a natural support, but carpooling is a good example of a natural support that many people use. We often think of transportation. I know in Maine, in particular in the rural areas, transportation is a real challenge, but sometimes I think we're trying to be the solution rather than saying, what's available out there naturally? How do other people get to work who don't drive? Do they carpool? Do they take buses? Do they have, what's else available? Are there community members who could help with this instead of us having to drive people to work? And also the personal network for job search and support. My colleague John Butterworth did some great work several years ago on natural supports, and he really talked about the expansion of natural supports beyond the workplace, but we need to also think of natural supports as people in the community and other entities that can provide support in the community, both in part of the job search, but also in terms of ongoing supports on the job. So that's just, again, things to think about in terms of how we think about natural supports. It goes beyond the workplace itself. The third thing I want to mention, the third myth, is that the type of intervention doesn't matter as long as it helps the person succeed on the job. I sometimes think there's this view that we just grab the bag, we take the bag of various interventions, and we'll talk about some of these more in a second, and just grab one, whatever's handy, and whatever falls out of the bag. That's the best thing. That's what we do, whatever the job coach is comfortable with. And frankly, sometimes it's easiest just to be the direct trainer. It's simple, in some ways simpler. But I think we need to recognize, and there is very clear research that shows that the type of intervention can have a major impact on the level of integration of the job, so how's the person going to be integrated, and long-term employment success. Some great work that was done by a gentleman named David Mank, who is at the Indiana University, but he was in Oregon when he did this work, and other folks have done similar work. It was really interesting what they learned. They learned a few things. Number one, if there's a need for somebody to basically have a job coach who's very intensively intervening, that is going to have a long-term effect in terms of how well the person ultimately gets integrated in the workplace. And secondly, it may have impact on wages, on hours, on all of those things. But as you think about it, I mean, that research was somewhat surprising. But as you think about it, the fact that if somebody goes into a workplace, has a job coach with them over the long term, that creates a barrier, possibly, if particularly that job coach isn't done carefully. I'll talk more in a few minutes about the need that we still do need job coaches, but we need to recognize that that is going to have an impact on the workplace and potential impact on long-term success. So as we do more intensive interventions, we need to think about that. It doesn't mean that we don't do them, because sometimes we've got to do them because that's the way the person's going to succeed on the job. But to recognize that once we start changing things around in the workplace, the design of the job, everything, and this even goes to the fact, and I'm a big believer in job creation and job carving and those strategies, which you might be familiar with in terms of rearranging a job. But if we do those things, if we're really creating a job for a person with a disability that didn't exist previously, that's carved out or created for them, again, that job design can sometimes have an impact in terms of people viewing that as the disability job or that person with disability not quite fitting in. So it's really important that we think about this as we're both designing the job and the interventions we're using. So there's a concept called the principles of least intrusion that was done by the folks in Szymanski and Parker. It's been around a long time, but it's something that I think we sometimes forget. It's also common sense. We begin with the least intrusive, most natural intervention before we use methods that are going to create greater intrusions. This second one, I think, is something we sometimes also forget. We should be having discussions with the person with a disability about our role as a professional support person. What do you want us to do? What's going to be least intrusive? What's respectful to you? I think it's a really good discussion to have. The strategy must fit naturally into the work environment as much as possible. That's not always easy to pull off, but we need to think about what's going to fit in here. And that also, we need to look at strategies that are maximize inclusion and maximize the possibilities of ultimately fading from the job site. I would make a great auctioneer, somebody's saying. Okay. I'll slow down a bit. I'm sorry. Speaking slow has never been my strength. I think you also need to think, frankly, about your role as a job coach. And again, I said this at the beginning, but I'm going to say this again. Your primary role is not to teach the individual how to do their job. You are really, and I really do think you need to think of yourself, I'm a detective, I'm an anthropologist, I have to look at, as I walk into a workplace, and this is a real skill, looking around, what's going on here? How do people do things? What supports are available? How do I leverage what's available here in this workplace? That is your primary job. And that is a real skill. It is, and I think it does take an ability to sort of think, to react, to develop relationships, to just analyze things. It's really important. And that ultimately we need to look at and recognize that our ultimate goal is the absolute minimum of support from the job coach. That does not mean, I will say this again and again, that it doesn't mean that there is no support from the job coach. That absolute minimum may still be extensive supports from a job coach, but we always should be trying to minimize that as much as possible. And Jacqueline Rodeville, who is a woman who is very active mental health advocacy, I heard her once say this. She's from New Jersey, but she said, we are the least best answer, the professional supports, which what she's saying here is we may be the best answer, but we are not, we are the least of the best answers. And we should always think about ourselves as kind of last on that list of potential answers in terms of interventions. So one thing, and one of the handouts you've got is that details these strategies, so I'm not going to go through them in detail. But I often think that employment specialists, job coaches, employment support professionals need to think of themselves as having a toolkit of a wide variety of tools that are available to support individuals um, um, of support individuals on the job, and always thinking about, okay, what's in the toolkit and what's going to work here, but what also is going to be the least intrusive. And this list of what I've got in front of you here, I've tried to order this in my mind sort of about from least intrusive to most intrusive, but that's also going to be very dependent on the individual situation. So I don't think I would ever cast any of those in stone. But obviously natural supports, things that are naturally available, that are naturally occurring, that is the most least intrusive. Natural supports that are facilitated, that means the job coach or even the individual themselves are kind of getting extra support, but it's still coming from naturally from the workplace. Self-maintenance techniques, kind of checklists, things like that. Those are, those are strategies that might be utilized. Identifying natural cues. And a good example a good example in our building, I'll tell you a natural cue in my building, is when the fire alarm goes off, that is a natural cue to leave the building. But a natural cue might be everybody's going to lunch, so you see everybody going to lunch, that is a natural cue. Or maybe adding cues. I know in my life, I have lots of cues that are added. The cues that I add in my life is that every one of my meetings is alarmed on my phone and on my computer, because otherwise I will miss them. I will forget them, because I get very scattered. That is a cue that I've added. One of the really cool things, and again, this is a whole other discussion, but certainly something worth having getting training on, I don't pretend that I have a lot of knowledge of this, is it's been really cool with all the technology that's out there, iPads and phones and all this kind of stuff that are now being used as part of the support for folks with disabilities that is really reducing some needs and level of support from professionals. Things like checkoff lists on phones and alarms and things like that, but even videos, instructional videos that people refer to when they're doing their jobs. It's amazing the stuff that's been happening out there in regards to that. So I certainly recommend kind of getting up to speed on some of that. Positive rewards. We all get, I assume everybody who's working for pay is getting one positive reward periodically, and the positive reward is your paycheck. That's an obvious one. But also positive rewards are, reassurance you did a good job, or a reward at the end of the day, or going out for a cup of coffee, or whatever those things. Those are all positive rewards. I sometimes reward myself if we're sitting at my desk for an hour to walk around, partially because it gets my brain going, but just I need to stretch my legs. Reasonable accommodations, again, a whole other big topic, but that's another thing that you should be aware of. You should have access to expertise, doing that. Assistive technology, again, also another potential tool. Again, these are getting more and more intensive in terms of time and in terms of intervention, in terms of what might happen. I'm getting noise. I don't know if other folks are getting that on the, thank you. The other, again, and now we're getting into employer training. That might be more intensive, that we're actually training coworkers, on how to work with somebody with a disability. Paid coworker support, I'm not sure what the availability of that is in Maine. That is something that's been done around the country in terms of paying the person, paying a coworker extra. What we find often with those interventions is actually the coworkers don't want the money. They're like, fine, I'm happy to help. I don't need to be paid. But there's been some cases, I think Missouri's been experimenting with this, particularly in rural areas where they don't have a lot of providers, about paying a coworker for support. And then we get into some really intensive supports, direct training of the individual, being essentially the trainer, systematic instruction, again, the task analysis approach. I am a big believer in that for folks with more significant disabilities. If you're not familiar with that, I highly recommend learning about that. That is the old, breaking tasks down step by step and then seeing how the person is doing and very systematically approaching it. I think in some ways it's been a lost art. And then the biggest intervention, I think, is making sure, assisting somebody to meet the production goals. Um, I'll give you an example of that. Years ago, when I was job coaching, we had a young man who actually wanted to wash dishes. He wanted to work in a kitchen. That's what he wanted to do, but he was not very quick at it. But that's the job he wanted. We found a job for him. We had to basically guarantee the place, the dishes will get done. And myself and my coworker Steve did an awful lot of dishes while we trained Tony on how to do the job. He learned it over time, and we did fade over time, but we basically had to guarantee them that the dishes would get done. And again, we do not want to make those guarantees to employers except in extreme circumstances. But in that particular case, that was somebody with a really significant disability. We felt this was going to be the way he would get the job, and yes, he was successful over the long term. But again, that's a pretty intensive intervention, both in terms of being on the site, but also a costly intervention. So again, thinking about everything in that toolbox and what's going to work best, that's going to minimize the level of intrusiveness. So again, the questions to think about, some of this we've already touched on. What supports are readily available? This should be the first thing you're thinking about. What's here? How can existing sorts be leveraged? How can we leverage these things? How can we leverage maybe a coworker being nearby who may be able to provide a little extra instruction? Or how can, or prompt the person to go on break, or help the person, check in the morning, whatever it might be. And then also, what other interventions that are unobtrusive might be available that don't require ongoing staff intervention? We should always be thinking about what can we do here that won't require ongoing staff intervention, a job coach being available. So it might be adding additional cues. It might be a self-management technique. It might be a piece of assistive technology. We should always be, as my colleague John Butterworth once said, the day the job coach gets on the job, they should be looking at the exit sign and figuring out, how do I get out of here as quick as possible, while at the same time being responsive to the needs of the individual and the employer. So, and this should be your mantra. Repeat it every day. Use what is there, adapt what is there, supplement what is there. That's the way we should approach this. Let's see. The job, also, myth number 4 is that we should focus on mastering the job tasks and then focus on social inclusion. I have been guilty of this. I will be the first to admit, as a job coach, that we focus because we're so like a word, oh my gosh, this person's got to learn this job and the task, and then worry about that social inclusion stuff later. What we need to realize is social inclusion comes first, not second. That's true of everybody. We all succeed or fail on jobs because of whether we're socially included. We could probably name names of people who we know who were not particularly great at their jobs, but everybody liked them, and they were part of the gang, and everybody, that's how people succeed on jobs. If people like you and you're part of the culture, you're going to succeed. And we've had people who are maybe pretty good at their jobs, but really were just never were included, often don't succeed. So this social inclusion is really, really important. And so, we really need to do everything we can to maximize the inclusion and make sure that people are in similar roles in the workplace. And so I'm not going to go through these I'm sorry, jumping ahead here. So again, some of this that we haven't touched on, looking at the social rules and norms, what's acceptable, what's allowable, how much difference is allowed, accepted, and appreciated. It's interesting. I worked for many years in a previous life in the food service and hospitality business. I can tell you, one reason a lot of folks who are a bit quirky work in that field, and people could say the same thing about me, is because it is an amazing tolerance for people from all walks of life, for all sorts of deviant behavior that would never be acceptable in another workplace. Because the primary criteria is you show up every day and you work hard, and we can deal with a lot of other stuff. And it is really, unlike other workplaces, which would never accept a lot of the behavior and things that go on there. So I think that's something that, and again, sometimes quirkiness, and in that kind of work environment, I think people being eccentric and a little out there is appreciated. I mean, I did hear once, just a little aside, but I think it's a funny story. Some of you may know Anthony Bourdain, who's on the Food Channel. He once said most people who work in kitchens should not be allowed in public unsupervised. I had a chuckle as somebody who's been in that environment. So I think it's something to think about, okay, as we look at work environments, where do people fit in, and will some people with disabilities, as we know, have some eccentricities, et cetera, like the rest of us, and so think about where they're going to fit in. What are the rules? What are the formal rules? What's informal? And we already touched on this. What's the culture? So this is the list of items, and on your handout you've got this in detail. But I think we need to think about sort of making sure that people with disabilities are part of these workplace cultures, these social rituals. A couple of them, that are part of everybody fitting in a workplace. And again, people with disabilities should be the same as everybody else. A few of them I do want to point out. I think schedules are really important. I think we have got to somehow get out of this habit of people with disabilities working very part-time schedules compared to coworkers. People coming and going at the same time and working same schedules as other coworkers is a really important part of being part of a workplace culture. You're not going to be part of our workplace culture if you're only there a couple of hours a week. I recognize the challenges in some regards of people working more hours, but it's something I think we need to collectively think about. Another one is, I think, the talking socially. I think sometimes we really need to work with people on how to interact appropriately and socially, kind of the water cooler talk, how to socially interact with coworkers and be appropriate in those interactions. Those are things that are really important. That's going to make people succeed or fail. I want to also point out the union membership. I don't know how many of you folks work with folks in unions, but this was an interesting story. When I was doing direct service work, we once had actually a work site where we had several people working, and they went on strike. The workers went on strike, and at first I was thinking, oh, well, our folks, this is the naivety of me of, our folks won't it really isn't appropriate for them to be picketing. And the job coach said, are you kidding? Of course they need to picket. Like everybody else, we did kind of supported picketing. They were out there with everybody else picketing the grocery store while they were on strike, and that I just sent, and later I'm like, I should have understood that is a big piece of social inclusion, of being out there on the picket line with your coworkers. And I think it sent a real message that these are coworkers, these are workers like everybody else. So again, we should never dismiss or think that it's not appropriate for somebody to be part of any of these types of activities, including, if there's a union action or anything like that. So I think also we need, these are the thing, this is one I think we were really good at screwing up. This myth that we think about natural supports and fading only once a person's on the job. And I think we need to recognize, and I see again and again, that when I see a bad job placement, 90% of the time it's because the thought did not go in ahead of time in terms of planning, in terms of job development, in terms of negotiating with the employer prior to the job, in terms of just even doing exploration and discovery with the person in terms of what's appropriate for them, that we basically have either it's a bad job match or we've negotiated the job very poorly and sent the wrong message to the employer. So, and then people will say, well, we can't fade, and it's like, well, guess what? It's really too late. I don't know how you're going to fade from this job site because it's either a bad job match or you've sent a message here to the employer that's going to be very hard to get out of. If you've been there all the time, interviewing, acting as a de facto trainer and supervisor, and suddenly you're saying, oh, by the way, it's time to fade, that's kind of difficult to pull off. So this needs to be thought of during the job planning for a job. What's a good job match? What kind of supports does this person need? What is the work culture they fit into? All those things need to be thought out a lot in terms of the planning process and really exploring them and through the exploration and discovery process, learning more about that. The person learns more about that themselves. And then in the job development process, again, I've seen too many examples of job developers, particularly when the job developer is not the job coach, who go in and basically promise the world to employer. Oh, you don't have to worry about this person. We'll have a job coach. They'll take care of everything, blah, 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 blah. And then what kind of expectation has been set up there? Rather than saying, which is what I used to do as I got better at job development, saying, this is going to be an employee like any other employee. Our expectation is you'll supervise them like any other employee, that they'll be part of your workplace, coworkers assisting them, et cetera, et cetera. We will be here to assist as needed, but we really think it's important that the person become part of your workplace from day one, and will be responsive if there's any issues, and we'll work with you. But we're not here to be, we're not here as, they're your employee, and you need to, manage them as you would any other employee. I mean, we have an employment support program here at ICI, and a few years ago we had an employer, there was somebody who was really having performance issues on the job. She worked at a major department store, and among her performance issues is what she periodically would get on the PA system and make announcements, inappropriate announcements, which she was not authorized to do. So she needed to be fired. But they called our job coach and said, oh, could you come in and fire her for us? And we're like, no, it's not our job to fire her. She needs to be disciplined. She needs to be directed on this. Now, I'm not sure if that was just a misunderstanding from the employer about the role of our job coaches, but, she had to go through progressive discipline, and she eventually got fired, in which she legitimately should have been. But it's, again, what kind of message is sent there if we have employers calling us and say, could you fire this person? So, again, all this is really important. Every phase of the process, including the post-placement support phase. When we get on that job site, as I said, day one, we need to be sending a very different message if we're going to do good natural supports and fading about the role of the job coach. If the job coach jumps in the job site and starts training the person immediately, rather than seeing what happens and seeing what natural supports kick in, if they haven't even done a little negotiation ahead of time on how this will work to ensure good integration of natural supports, it's not going to work over the long term. So really important to think about it. The next myth is that the emphasis on natural supports means there's never need for intensive one-to-one assistance long-term from a job coach. That is a myth, and I've really been concerned when I hear particularly public systems thinking that we got in this, in my view, ridiculous debate in the mid-'90s as natural supports were being pushed. Those of you who've been around a while may remember this. Well, we'd have discussions at conferences about natural supports versus traditional support and employment. And I would sit there, and I was pretty new to the field at that point. But this is a ridiculous discussion. It's not either or. It's, it's kind of figuring out what's going to work best in the situation and a combination thereof. I think part of the discussion was because people who had sort of always assumed that there was a need for that very intensive job coaching were now feeling like we were throwing out support and employment. That was not at all. We were just evolving it. So the reality is we do have folks with really significant needs who are going to need a lot of intensive job coaching, one-to-one assistance. There is cases, it's a rare case where somebody needs a job coach permanently. It's very costly. It's, those are folks with really significant disabilities. It should be the exception to the rule. But there are times, and I already gave you the example of Tony, who I worked with, who we were on the job 3 months straight with him. Eventually we did fade, but that was a very intensive support. So that's really important. But we should be doing this only as necessary and recognizing, as we discussed earlier, that if we're going to do a really intensive one-to-one support, it's going to have an impact on integration, negative impact on integration inclusion. We've got to be conscious of that and do everything we can to avoid the potential negative impact because we're there kind of getting in the way. The next one is that fading and natural supports mean no need for ongoing support. I've literally heard of systems, one state where they said, well, for supported employment, it ends after 2 years. We're not going to fund it after 2 years from our intellectual developmental disability system. And, that in my mind is a complete misunderstanding of supported employment and what this is all about. Supported employment means ongoing post-placement support for as long as necessary and as much as necessary. That is the core definition of supported employment. That support may be permanent. Does it mean it's intensive all the time? No, it might mean basically, and hopefully it will evolve to a very periodic check-in, what's going on with the individual, what's going on with the employer in a very respectful way, maybe coming back in and checking on the job site periodically, maybe going back and doing some retraining if there's some issues. But fading does not mean fading to absolutely nothing. And I think that's also really important for systems and for organizations to check in to understand. I also think that organizations, and again, when I do longer-term training on this, we talk more about this, organizations, support organizations, need to have a really good customer service view of this in terms of employers and in terms of the individual. How to be responsive, how to be there when you need to be there, but not too much. But to ensure employers, we are available when you need it for whatever you need. So the next myth, when there are problems with fading, you should just continue job coaching. This is the one I always say, well, we can't fade. The person's having trouble with this task. We just need to keep hanging out on the job because they can't do this portion of the job. At that point, I think, simply continuing to do job coaching is not the solution. If there's a problem fading, and you really need to sit back and say, what's going on here? Let's take a systematic look. Let's analyze the situation. Where are the issues here? And let's figure out a solution. And it just can't be, let's keep a job coach there. And we need to think about things as, is this the right job? Did we, frankly, is it the right job for the person? Have we understood through experience that this is just not going to work over the long term? Does the employer have the same expectations as we do? If we sent the right message, does the employer expect there to be a job coach there permanently? Have the staff supports been geared towards fading? Some of the stuff we've already touched on. Did we really think about how we're going to fade? Have we set up the supports for fading, or is the job coach continue to be the de facto supervisor and trainer? Have we tried every tried every tool in the toolbox? Have we pulled every one? Have we looked at that list and said, what haven't we tried? Have we tried an accommodation? Have we tried assistive technology? Do we need to get an expert on accommodations done on the job site? Somebody who's a rehabilitation engineer or somebody like that. Thinking about that. Have we tried everything we can? What does the data tell us? And what I really am referring to here is, have we looked at how much we're on the job site? Are we using our systematic instruction data and seeing how much we're fading? This is, again, where I think systematic instruction task analysis can be a great tool. Really looking at what strategies are we using, how much do we need to intervene, and what type of intervention are we doing? Are we doing verbal prompts? Are we just having to do kind of other types of prompts? Are we doing, and how often do we have to intervene and things like that? Do we see improvement also over time in the person mastering the tasks they're having difficulty with? That's the other great thing about systematic instruction. We hopefully see increases over time in the mastery of tasks. If we're not seeing that, then we've got to figure out another strategy if they're not mastering it all, if they're not making improvement. And again, does the job design encourage use of natural supports? Have we done that? Also think about what's going on in the rest of the person's life. Oftentimes, all of us only have non-work issues or supports. Is there stress in the person's life? Are they getting the support at home? Are they getting enough sleep? All those kind of things, or things happening in their personal life. Have they had a loss or something that's creating issues? That's really important. Also, and again, are the current efforts helping or hurting fading? I think also this last question is an important one. What happens if we're not there? Do we sort of let nature take its course? Is the person going to get fired, or should we just try this out and see what happens? Because sometimes, guess what? The person will figure it out for themselves, or the coworkers will figure it out. I think sometimes we are so nervous and so afraid of somebody losing a job, and I've been there, that we over-intervene. And sometimes we just need to see what's going to happen here, and what do we do differently. But I think if we also think, maybe do we need to talk to a coworker and say, and renegotiate the job? You know what, this task they can't do. Can they do something different here? Can somebody else take that over? Or can a coworker help with them with that? Those are the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of this. But we need to think about this very thoughtfully and systematically. I think a group meeting with staff is really an important strategy. Sitting down with the employer and saying, here's where we're at. Here's what we're struggling with. Can you help us here? They may have ideas. So not just thinking we just got to keep on job coaching. And the point I want to make with this slide in terms of determining a fading schedule, some of this we've already touched on, but I think the key piece of this is that fading, we often think the person has to be independent, and they have to have mastered the job. I've been at ICI 20 years. They're still waiting for me to master my job. They're hoping it'll happen someday, or for me to be independent on the job. Again, none of us are independent. None of us truly master our job. And I think sometimes we think that they have to have everything figured out. I mean, I think look back at the old supported employment literature. They used to often talk about the person mastering the job or full independence. What fading requires is the availability of sufficient supports so you don't need a job coach anymore. That's what you have to think about. Are there sufficient supports in place that don't require a job coach on an ongoing basis? That's the thing to think about. Not that they're perfect on the job, not that they've mastered the job, but that there's enough supports in place, natural supports and other types of supports that we put in place. So here are my final thoughts. I've seen some action on the chat box, and we can maybe touch on that. But final thoughts on this topic. Natural supports, require a thoughtful, systematic approach, and then fading as well. This not only is about an individual, so we really need to think about what does this person need, how do we make sure that the natural supports are maximized, how do we ensure that there's fading that occurs, but also in program design. If we're going to, and actually systems design has to be thought about this, if we're going to really focus on natural supports and fading, we really need to think about how are staff trained? How is our program designed? Do we have it designed in a way in terms of all aspects of job development, job placement, planning, discovery, everything we're doing? are we doing this from a natural supports perspective, from a perspective that encourages fading? Or are we still going with the mindset, either overtly or just because it's where we used to, of that caretaker mode, of that, trainer mode, of that person who's in charge mode? That, are we really thinking about, are we really going to do things differently? And I do think this requires, to really do it well, sitting back and looking at all aspects of how you're delivering employment assistance and supports, and thinking about how do we do this from a natural supports mindset in a way that is least intrusive, but that still provides the support that the person needs and assistance they need. Also, this is one of my sort of things that I talk a lot about, is we have way too many direct support staff. I'm not saying anybody in Maine is like this. Actually, I think you guys have some of the better training in terms of mandated training that's out there, and I've always applauded Maine for that, and certainly appreciate it. I wish I'd see more than in other states. But I think we have too many job coaches in general that go out to job sites who aren't trained, or are just kind of thought of as trainers, and then we take people who've been not trained at all on the various techniques of supporting a person on a job, and are basically thrown out there, literally 2 days on the job. Okay, go job coach. Job coaching is not nuclear science, but it is a complex thing to do it well. You really need to understand the dynamics of workplaces and how workplaces work. Understand the various interventions and be thoughtful about the interventions that you're going to be using. You need to be a great facilitator, a great community organizer, a great having a great ability to brainstorm and be creative. Those are really important skills for somebody. So they need to be well trained. And ultimately, you need to recognize, as we've emphasized, is that the role of the professional is to facilitate and support social inclusion and social change. That is your job here. I've always said about this is how I look at this field and look at my role, all of our collective roles. And this is a very different way I think of it. Yeah, our job is to help people get jobs, succeed in jobs, and get a paycheck. But I always think of that, in my view, as a social worker, and I'm a social worker by training, and a social change, as that's just kind of the mechanism to really change the view of the world of people with disabilities and view of people with disabilities of themselves. The job and the paycheck are just the ways to get there. But this really is about making our world, as I said, a much more open place, a much more thoughtful place about who has value, who can be successful, what a successful employee is, all of those things. Who is welcome in our society, about our whole emphasis on diversity. That's what this really is all about. So keeping that in mind while you're out there is really important. I think can give you some reassurance about the importance of your role. So that's the end of my formal presentation. Happy to take questions, and we can take a look at some of the chatting tasks. I do want to mention the two handouts. The Job Coach Tool handout, which was sent to you, and also the Workplace Inclusion Checklist. Both, I think, really good practical tools that can be useful. I'll certainly make copies, share them with other folks. Happy to use them. And when I come back up there to do the full-day training, we'll have additional handouts as well. I appreciate your sitting there and listening and sharing your ideas and thoughts in the chat box. Happy to take additional questions. I don't know if, Debbie, you have any thoughts or comments?
Fabulous, David. I'm looking forward to your day-long workshop, but I think you did a wonderful job of busting some myths, if you will, and some very thoughtful suggestions around strategies that folks can use. I'm not seeing questions in the chat, so I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to talk about and remind folks, I guess, about the performance measure related to fading.
Hi, this is Lisa Sturdivant, and David, thank you. I think for all of us sitting here, we're all nodding our heads as you're going through the training, thinking about the work that we do to support people, and in our histories of good situations and not so good situations where we've made promises to employers maybe, or have people working in situations where we haven't paid attention to building support. So again, I think this is a good teaser for the full day event that you are going to come back when it's not snowing and do in Maine.
You can't promise that.
I wanted to ask, though, David, before I talk about performance-based contracting, I think one of the things we struggle with is we have some individuals in the DD system that have been working for a while that we've placed on not on the employer payroll, but they remain on an agency payroll. And the business has struggled since we placed them in sort of the old mindset or the old model with really feeling responsible. This is not their employee. They have a contract with a provider agency. Have you maybe thoughts, David, or suggestions about how we can help to transition, even while the individual remains on the provider payroll, some of that support over to a business who maybe has had somebody for 10 or 15 years and really hasn't taken over any of the support? Any thoughts on that?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting, okay, there we go. I think the big thing to me is, it goes back to sort of the design, original design is to be frank, problematic. And I think that's a real challenge in terms of where do you go from here in terms of, I don't have like the magic. I do think it's starting to, I would say a couple of things here. I think part of the negotiation with an employer needs to be starting to sort of say, you know what, we set this up this way years ago. It's worked, but we really are rethinking how we're going about things. As we've learned, can we start to negotiate this a little bit in terms of changing this over, in terms of because I do think I'm really, you know, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of a design that frankly is problematic in terms of, because the person's really not integrated, they're getting paid by the provider and things like that. So I think you need to look at each situation. I wish I could say, yeah, here's the magic solutions, Lisa, but I think you need to look at each situation and say, how can we start a discussion here with an employer about this in terms of that we want to evolve away from this. You obviously don't want the people losing the jobs. I mean, this is kind of, it's almost, and I think a parallel here is, frankly, you know, shelter workshops and things like that, which we set up years ago thinking, yes, it's good, and now we've got to wean ourselves off this stuff. And you can't just, you don't want to do it all at once. You just don't want us to have a blanket policy. Okay, we're not doing this anymore, but okay, how do we start to evolve away from that? So I think, so the first thing I would say is don't continue to do it as a, collectively don't set up new arrangements like that. And I think starting to look at these on a case-by-case basis, and maybe it's one person at a time in terms of trying to maybe go to and see how that works. I also think drawing out the employer concerns on this and saying, okay, how can we set this up in a way that will address your concerns? What are your concerns here about us moving this person over to the payroll? I mean, obviously they like it because it's easy to get rid of the person. It's also easy to, they don't, you know, they're not ultimately responsible. There may be some other costs involved. But if the person's been a good employee and been there a long time, I think hopefully it can be at least, there can be some at least advocacy done. So I wish I had better answers than that, but I'm hoping that's helpful.
No, and thank you, David. I think it is very helpful. I think when states have systems that were set up, you know, historically, and those situations have, you know, continued, although I think we're moving towards a place where obviously assisting people with finding new jobs, we're doing a much better job ensuring that somebody's on a business payroll, that we are doing some of the things that you really suggest today. But I know for some of those older situations, we do have this period of where we need to probably renegotiate with businesses and relook at those, as you said, each of those individual situations. So that was very helpful.
Okay. The other thing I'll add on that, I think, is because I do think, again, this is the evolution of our field. I think we used to think that we had to do those situations because that was the way people were going to get jobs, without recognizing the potential negative impact of that. I think we've learned a lot about that. But I also think that, again, I'm not here to tell you what your policy should be or whatever, but I think it's got to be a really extreme situation in this day and age where we're going to do kind of essentially a subcontract situation is what we're talking about. And I would also have really restrictive time limits on it if we're going there. I think, you know, my recommendation from a policy perspective is it's not something that is encouraged, or it's something that should almost be subject to a high level of administrative review. I get concerned. I see this here in Massachusetts. I still think we have providers and staff who go out to businesses and just automatically offer, well, you know, you could subcontract with us if it's easier, instead of, and that really should be, you know, we do job development training. We have a thing called sweeteners and whole cards. That should be a whole card. That should be like, my God, this is the perfect job for this person. don't know what else, but the employer is not willing to hire. Maybe this is a situation where we pull that out of the bottom of the deck and say, I'll tell you what, can we subcontract for a short period of time? Just so you can try out the person for a month or two, and then it'll evolve. But that should be like the perfect situation when you're going in there and saying, okay, this is the thing we pull out because otherwise this isn't going to work. But it should not be an automatic thing that's offered up front. It should not be the opener in the negotiation. It should be the thing that's pulled out at the end.
Thank you, David. I think what Deb wanted me to highlight, and Letitia's sitting beside me so we can both do this, but DHHS has implemented performance-based contracting measures, and for both ODES and SAMs, we have a measure to look at agencies' reduction of paid support over time for individuals. So I think, again, for people on the phone, a reminder that this is an area that we want to be able to provide support, assistance, review as you are supporting the individuals in our system to make connections on the job, to look at other ways, as David had mentioned, of building in support. So again, I think this type of information is exactly what we need. David, do you, I know that ICI has a placement plan and a natural supports. Do you sort of have a format that you use?
Yeah, we have a really simple, I'd be happy to send it. We have a very simple, we have two things. We have a 30-day placement plan,
Yes.
and then we have a placement support plan. It is, again, I don't think it's rocket science, but I also people found those kind of tools really helpful in terms of just strategies. I'd be happy to send those.
That would
David, if you could send those to me, I'll make sure that everybody participating today gets copies of those.
Yeah, I think it forces a conversation is what it does, which is really useful in terms of that. Yep.
And I think that in terms of, again, I think what we hope is that by giving support to providers to really think this through, that there are people like David and other individuals who have been doing a lot of work on what's the best practice, what does work, and David, I appreciate your approach of coming in there and thinking about the ways, what is the role of an employment specialist or a job coach, and I think too often we think it's that, we are the authority on, the job or the business or whatever, and when in fact we're not. So I think this, again, gives us an opportunity to sort of think through some of these situations and going forward. I don't know, Letitia, if there's anything else about mental health performance-based contracting?
Well, I think the only thing that I would add is for mental health long-term supported employment, our measure really uses a ratio of the LTSE hours to the hours worked to determine, what's the appropriateness of job placement. We've seen use of effective job coaching strategies and natural supports in the work environment, as indicating promoting job independence and self-sufficiency. And, what we created with that is the ratio that 90% of the individuals receiving long-term supported employment will have a ratio of LTSE service hours to hours worked of 25% or less during a reported quarter. And that gives that window to recognize, some individuals at various points will, starting a new job or other times will need a higher level, but what we look for is to see the number of hours decreasing as an indicator of the fading supports, as David said, not to necessarily eliminate them, although, for some individuals, and as you all know, well, they've got the job, they're working well, and they don't need the supports anymore, and that's great, and then there are other individuals to start working with. So, but we were really excited to have this resource to help individuals and providers to really get some technical assistance in meeting some of those performance measures. Some of our providers are struggling to meet that measure on the mental health side, and so we've been having some conversations and trying to connect people, and hopefully we'll have several more folks that are signing up for the full day. We're hoping, since we
Yeah,
had to
well,
move, we might.
Yep. We'll get that information out as soon as I confirm dates for rescheduling. Looking at the time, just wanted to let folks know we've got some upcoming events. There will be no WDS webinar in January. We're giving you all a break. We're covering assistive technology in the workplace in February. We're going to review the new Workforce Investment and Opportunities Act, WIOA, and Employment First in March. And the fine folks at Maine Medical Center's WIPA program are going to do a session on financial planning in April. Our ACRE training is scheduled for March. The registrations are coming in, so if you need that training, sign up soon. Discovering Personal Genius is scheduled for January 27th and May 20th. And we're doing a 3-part series. This is hot off the press for transition educators, January 26th, May 18th, and 19th. That's a 3-part series. So there's lots going on. Watch the calendar and your email boxes. David, once again, this was fabulous. Thanks for joining us. I'm glad we could pull it off remotely. Wish you were here in person. That would have been more fun.
So do I, but...
But we'll see you soon in Maine, and everyone, travel safe. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Was
Thanks,
it
Dave.
Evaluation.
Don't forget to do your evaluations, and email Joyce if you have questions. Thanks.